What up, rock stars? It's Melodious. Welcome back to another Melodious Rockstar reaction. And today we're gonna react to the four astronauts that went to the moon. Um Definitely they broke history, so definitely want to tap into that. Um yeah.
At 6:35 p.m. local time on April 1st, 2026, NASA's Space Launch System rocket lifted off from the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida, marking the first time that a crew of people has departed the Earth to visit our moon in over 53 years.
Wow.
The launch itself went about as smoothly as these things get. There was one brief and minor concern in the minutes leading up to the scheduled launch time. Ground crews were a little concerned about readings from the Flight Termination System, what they call the FTS. It's basically a string of explosives that are rigged up to the main fuel tank of the rocket, and they act as a self-destruct mechanism if the booster was to ever lose control for any reason as it flies through the air. So the crew would abort and their capsule would fly away, then the entire rocket would explode before it posed any risk of falling on people. So it's the kind of system that you hope not to use, but you definitely want it to work properly if the need ever comes up. That little bit of chatter around the FTS delayed the launch by just a few minutes from the opening of the flight window at 6:24 p.m. But the issue was quickly resolved when the ground crew realized that they just had a faulty sensor reading and the system itself was actually working just fine. This came as a pleasant surprise to anyone who had been following the troubled journey of NASA's most powerful rocket, the SLS, probably best known for being over budget and behind schedule. This particular stack had given NASA problems earlier in the year when it started leaking hydrogen during a system test in February. Then after that was fixed, it started leaking helium a few days later, which led NASA to rolling the vehicle back into their assembly building, where it was taken apart and put back together and finally returned to the launch pad to await its crew. Of the four people on board NASA's moon rocket, 3 are American astronauts.
Now this guy right here, Victor Glover, he's going to be the first black person on the moon. So definitely a big achievement.
Commander Reed Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, and mission specialist Christina Cook. They are joined by Canadian Space Agency mission specialist Jeremy Hansen, the first Canadian to participate in a crewed moon mission.
Wow.
But he's not the only international contribution to the Artemis program. The service module attached below the crew capsule that provides power, propulsion, and life support was actually made in Germany under a contract from the European Space Agency. This was reflected in the name that the crew chose for their spacecraft, Integrity, a nod to the integrated nature of the vehicle, the rocket, and entire Artemis program, with teams from across the USA and around the world working together to make this mission possible. And within seconds of booster ignition, the Integrity and her crew rose into a clear blue sky above the Florida coast, riding the most powerful rocket NASA has ever launched.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, I'm told that it breaks into 3 pieces, guys. The first piece is the piece that drops back off, but it's the piece that helps launch them into space.
8.5 minutes into the flight, at an altitude of about 100 miles above the surface, the booster engines were shut down and the spacecraft was released into Earth orbit.
Wow.
From here, the Integrity is still connected to the upper stage of the SLS, which is a single rocket engine capable of raising the spacecraft to an altitude of about 43,500 miles above the surface. After reaching this high Earth orbit about 1 hour into flight, this is where the crew took a bit of a pause on their trip to the moon to conduct a full systems check of their spacecraft. This is only the second time that an Orion series capsule has flown, and the first one to carry people on board, so the idea is to make sure that everything is working properly before committing to the moon. And there were some issues reported by the crew during this time. The first and probably most unfortunate was a problem with the Universal Waste Management System, which is a fancy way to say the toilet.
Oh, man. Yeah, that sucks. You in space for a couple of days and now you gotta use the bathroom and the toilet don't work. Oh, man.
This was supposed to be one of the biggest upgrades for a modern crew traveling to the moon. The old Apollo guys just had to do their business in plastic bags, while the new spacecraft is equipped with a full bathroom stall. Turns out a problem with the suction fan stopped the pee hose from working properly, But the space toilet was still functional for the number 2, so for number 1, astronauts had to resort to something called the collapse contingency urinal, which is a fancy way to say peeing in a bag. The only other problem they experienced was an IT issue with their Microsoft Outlook email. Apparently, the crew got 2 official NASA accounts and they couldn't log into either of them. This will come as no surprise to anyone who's ever worked in a Microsoft Teams office. But with all of that out of the way, in the evening of April 2nd, ground crews unanimously voted to clear integrity for a translunar injection burn. This is when they fired the main engine on the European Service Module to transition from an orbit around the Earth to a trip around the Moon. After completing the burn, the spacecraft is committed to a very specific path known as the free return trajectory. It's the most efficient way to get from the Earth to the Moon and then back again because it uses gravity from the 2 bodies to handle most of the steering. As they approach the Moon, its gravity will naturally sling them around the far side and throw the ship back the way it came, at which point gravity from the Earth will take over and begin to pull them back home. This makes for a relatively slow trip, so the crew stayed busy by turning their cameras back toward the Earth. Wow. These are the first high-resolution digital images that show our entire planet in one frame. Most photographs that you see of Earth are composites, meaning they had to take a bunch of different photos and stitch them together to show the entire globe. That's because anything in a typical Earth orbit is just too close to see the entire thing. This photograph, which is now titled Hello World, was taken with a wide-angle lens on a Nikon D5 camera on April 3rd at a distance of about 100,000 miles into space. You can see the first light of the sun just beginning to peek out over the horizon, so the light that we're seeing on the Earth itself is actually reflecting off the Moon and filling in the night side of the planet. The scene would have looked much darker to the naked eye, but it's brought to life by the Nikon D5's unique ability to capture detail images in extremely low light situations. As the Earth grew smaller in their windows, the crew of Integrity would spend Saturday and Sunday running tests and experiments on board the ship as they prepared for the main event, the lunar flyby. What separates Artemis 2 from every Apollo moon mission is the distance they will cover. At their furthest point from Earth, the crew reached a distance of over 252,000 miles, further than any person has ever traveled from home. Wow. This gives them a very unique perspective on the moon itself because at an altitude of about 4,000 miles, they get to see the entire thing fill their spacecraft windows. Right. It's kind of like if you held a basketball out at the end of your arm. That's how big the moon would appear to the eyes of the crew. The guys on Apollo orbited the moon at a much lower altitude, just a few hundred miles, so they could only ever see one small area at a time, and they were always circling around the equator of the moon, so they never had a clear view of the polar regions. Now, during their approach to the moon, the crew was able to spot 2 previously unidentified craters on the surface, and this is kind of the emotional heart of the entire mission. One of those new craters was proposed to be named Integrity to commemorate this mission and the vehicle that carried them there. The second is a bright spot crater that lies right on the boundary between the near and far side. This one was proposed to be named Carol, after Reed Wiseman's late wife who passed away in 2020. Those bright spots were one of the first really interesting observations made by the crew. These fresh impacts kick up light-colored dust from just below the surface and stand out against the dull gray of the moon.
Now, I watched somewhere that it said a video, and it said that the moon get these craters from like different things crashing into it, like different explosions that happen in space. Yeah.
Christina Cook noted that these are so bright they kind of look like holes poked in a map shade. And this is the kind of observation that is so important from Artemis 2. Even with a really great digital camera, there is still a lot of nuance that only the human eye can see. Our eyes perceive a much greater dynamic range between dark and bright than any camera sensor. And we also see a lot more color. Here's an illustration of that. The big curving shape is the entire visible color spectrum, and that triangle inside is the small fraction that can fit into a digital image. So while the photographs still have incredible value, the most unique data from Artemis 2 is the first-person accounts of the astronauts as they describe what they see on the moon with their own eyes. For example, the crew noted that the moon is not actually as gray as it appears from Earth. They saw distinct hues of brown and even a faint green in some of the impact crater regions.
Wow, green.
As Integrity drew closer to the moon, they started crossing the boundary that separates the near side from the far side. That transition is marked by a large impact crater known as the Orientale Basin. It's 600 miles wide and 3.8 billion years old, and Artemis 2 was the first time people have ever seen the entire thing. As the spacecraft rounds over Orientale, the far side of the moon begins to reveal itself. This is our moon like you have never seen it before. People often refer to this as the dark side, but it gets just as much sun as any other place on the moon. The weird part about it is that this side always faces away from us on Earth, so we've only ever seen the whole thing through satellite images. The first thing that you'll notice is it's a much lighter region. There are none of those big dark spots that we associate with the face of the moon. Those are ancient volcanic lakes that filled up with lava rock billions of years ago when the moon was forming. So we know that for some reason the volcanoes were concentrated on the Earth-facing side, but we don't know why that is. This is one of the mysteries that the Artemis program is hoping to solve. So with the absence of any volcanic activity to smooth it out, the far side of the moon is marked by heavy cratering. You can see that most clearly in images that the crew photographed along the terminator line. That's the transition from night to day. And through here, the low angle of the sunlight creates a super high contrast between dark shadowed lowlands and brightly lit highlands. The crew noted in their remarks during this time that the surface of the moon is nowhere near as flat as it appeared from a distance. There are actually tall peaks and steep cliffs around these impact craters, making for a rough and complex geography. One of the areas that they were able to see as the spacecraft circled around the far side was the South Bull Aitken Basin. This is where NASA wants to land future Artemis missions with crew on board and eventually build a permanent outpost on the moon. We can see pretty clearly from these observations that the Artemis landings will be nothing like the old Apollo missions. Those touched down on the flat volcanic plains of the equator region on the near side, while the terrain for Artemis will be so much more rugged and challenging to navigate. Turning their attention back toward home, the crew is able to witness another unique phenomenon. Not a sunset, but an Earthset, as our planet begins to dip down below the horizon of the moon. It's around this point that Integrity loses contact with the Earth. That's not a problem, it's just an unfortunate effect of using laser-based communications. Once the moon passes in between the ship and the Earth, the line of communication is broken. So for a period of about 40 minutes, these four people were totally unreachable. Must be nice. As they came back into communication range, they witnessed an Earthrise, an image that was made famous by the crew of Apollo 8 when they captured this photograph on Christmas Eve in 1968. And now we have our own version of the Earthrise for our own generation. From this point on, Integrity is now moving away from the moon and back toward home. Later that evening, they witnessed yet another sight that no human eye had seen before, a total eclipse of the sun from the far side of the moon. So typically when we see an eclipse, the sun and moon appear almost exactly the same size. Right. But from out here, the moon appears much bigger than the sun. This allowed the total eclipse to last nearly 54 minutes and allowed the crew to capture photographs of the moon with the stars and planets in the background. So for any of your moon landing conspiracy friends who ask why you can't see stars from the moon, it's because the sun was out every other time we went there. When the sun goes away, the stars come out, just like on Earth. The day ended with a congratulatory phone call to the crew from President Trump and NASA leadership, while preparations were made to bring them home on the final leg of the...
Now it looked like they out of their spacesuits. I wonder when they can actually take their spacesuits off and when do they have to, have it on. I'm guessing during launch and maybe on the way back, I'm guessing. I don't know. If y'all know, comment below.
The journey. Another 4 days before they reach the Earth's atmosphere and begin the most dangerous phase of the mission. Re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere is a complicated maneuver. The capsule has to hit at just the right angle to cut through. If it comes in too shallow, then it'll actually bounce off and go flying back up into
Not
space.
bounce off,
If
that's
the angle is
crazy.
too steep, then the capsule builds up too much resistance too fast and overheats. So NASA takes a lot of care with guiding integrity in for its final descent. This is done using maneuvering thrusters.
I can only imagine y'all bouncing off. Like, could you imagine, when it's time to go back and it's bouncing off? Like, what do you do when it bounces off and goes back? Like, do you restart over again, or is you done forever? Like, how does that work?
Congratulatory phone call to the crew from President Trump and NASA leadership while preparations were made to bring them home on the final leg of the journey.
That'd have been super nervous.
Another 4 days before they reach the Earth's atmosphere and begin the most dangerous phase of the mission. Re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere is a complicated maneuver. The capsule has to hit at just the right angle to cut through. If it comes in too shallow, then it'll actually bounce off and go flying back up into space. If the angle is too steep, then the capsule builds up too much resistance too fast and overheats. So NASA takes a lot of care with guiding integrity in for its final descent. This is done using maneuvering thrusters on the service module. Now, once everything is lined up for re-entry, a lot of stuff begins to happen in a relatively short time. About 20 minutes before reaching the atmosphere, pyrotechnic charges fire and separate the integrity capsule from the service module. The crew doesn't need it anymore, and the service module will safely burn up as it re-enters. Once separated, the integrity capsule fires up its own maneuvering thrusters to perform a flip and gets its heat shield pointing down into the direction of travel. As the capsule falls down through the upper atmosphere, the Earth's gravity begins to pull harder, and it accelerates to a top speed of about 32 times the speed of sound. At this velocity, the capsule begins slamming into the first air molecules, which are still very thin at this altitude, but there's enough atmosphere to begin the heating process. As we see the first sign of flames begin to light up outside the capsule window, communications with the crew go dead. The energy from the spacecraft compresses the molecules in the atmosphere so violently that they explode into a state of matter called plasma.
Whoa.
Not only is this plasma super hot, between 4,000 and 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, but it's also so energized that it begins to conduct electricity. The electric charge is what disrupts communications between the crew and the ground team. It's like flying inside a lightning storm.
Right.
This continues for 6 whole minutes until wind resistance has slowed the capsule down enough that it's no longer creating a plasma field. That force of deceleration has an effect of about 4G on the astronauts inside, the equivalent of about 4 times Earth's gravity. And this is the point where NASA regains communication with integrity, and the world is relieved to hear that all is well with the crew on board. From here, it's a few more minutes of free falling as the first cameras begin to track integrity on its descent. At an altitude of around 5,000 feet, the main parachutes finally deploy, and the capsule slows down to a gentle 19 miles per hour.
Could you imagine being in that capsule and you just seeing fire outside the window? Like, yo.
For the final coast phase. It's 5:07 p.m. local time off the coast of San Diego, California, when Integrity makes their official
So if I'm not mistaken, they left from Florida.
splashdown into the Pacific Ocean, completing a 10-day journey that covered a total of 695,081 miles from the Earth to the Moon and back again. Once they are floating in the water, the capsule deploys 5 red helium balloons from the nose. Those are just to make sure it doesn't tip over. Although conditions on landing are pretty calm, at least as far as the Pacific Ocean goes, with waves peaking at about 4 feet high. There's only one minor issue post-splashdown, and that's with the communications between the astronauts and their recovery crew. Commander Reed Wiseman reports that he can hear the rescuers, but they can't hear him. So that results in a little bit of a delay, with recovery boats just circling around the capsule and waiting for instructions. But eventually, the first boat moves in and they open the hatch on the capsule from the outside, giving our crew their first breath of fresh, non-recycled air since last Wednesday afternoon. 4 Navy officers from the recovery boat hop into the capsule and begin to assess each astronaut, help them with getting out of their harness and space helmet and getting set for the main recovery operation. They attach a big inflatable raft to the capsule underneath the open hatch that's nicknamed the front porch, and one by one, the crew leave their capsule and drop onto the porch where they wait for a line to come down from a recovery helicopter. There are 2 choppers running 1 astronaut at a time, picking them up from the porch and dropping them onto the deck of a Navy ship waiting nearby. From there, they go straight down to the ship's medical bay for a full examination. All signs throughout the landing and recovery operation pointed to all 4 astronauts being in good health, but they will continue to be monitored out of an abundance of caution. And that concludes the most important human spaceflight mission of the 21st century. The first crewed moon mission in my lifetime, but certainly not the last. A proper beginning for a new space race and the era of human beings expanding our civilization to the moon and beyond.
All right, yo.
At 6.
I really enjoyed that. That was pretty cool. I'm out. Peace.